giving excellent fidelity and response. The age of classic hi-fi stereo began in the late 50s with RCA's invention of the cutting head and playback system for stereo records. Many manufacturers were coming out with combined integrated units as well as new separate components. Macintosh, Sherwood, Harman Kardon, Bell were all some of the major players, and this Scott system featured dual integrated amps. This home entertainment system was completely built into a console. This Fisher system also features a television set. This is a Harman Kardon setup with the matching Harman Kardon speakers. This system uses a Macintosh MC240, and this one uses a Citation 3 with a Dynaco preamp. This is the famous JBL Paragon speaker system. Another Harman Kardon with Macintosh preamp. This is a Macintosh setup with a Thorns turntable. And finally, a Marantz setup with a Marantz 7C and dual turntables. Acrosound produced the UL120 amp in the late 50s and early 60s. This amp produced 120 watts or 60 watts per side from a pair of EL34s. The signal and driver tubes are all mounted on a printed circuit board. Altic Lansing continued to produce mono amps in the late 50s with this 350. Using a pair of 6550s, it produces 40 watts RMS. Output and power transformers are the famous Peerless variety. Dynakit produced the Stereo 70 beginning in about 1959 up until the late 60s. This was perhaps one of the most popular of all stereo basic power amps, producing 35 watts per side from a pair of EL34s, all mounted on a nickel chrome plated chassis. Driver tubes are the 7199 variety. Dynaco's first stereo preamp was the Pass 2, coming out in about 1959. It was a full-featured unit with several inputs and outputs. The ICO HF85 preamp and 86 power amp were very popular in their day. In the late 50s, the do-it-yourself craze caught on, and many people wanted to build their own and were very proud of their accomplishments. The HF85 was ICO's first stereo preamplifier. The matching HF86 power amplifier used a pair of 6 BQ5s per channel, which amounted to about 12 watts RMS. This amplifier is a very sweet-sounding one and could be used for horn systems today. Fisher was one of the largest manufacturers of hi-fi equipment in the United States. The X1000 is the largest integrated amp ever produced. It puts out about 55 watts per channel or 110 watts total. This integrated amplifier is fully featured with a center channel, dual headphone jacks, separate bass and treble for each channel, as well as switchable inputs, mode selector, phase reverse, balance, loudness contour, space expander, and dimension controls. The X1000 uses 4 EL34 output tubes. It also has massive output transformers and a variety of inputs and outputs. Fisher produced the 800B receiver in about 1962, which had both AM and FM stereo multiplex built in. There were tuning eye indicators for each band, and the amplifier produced about 65 watts. The 500C came out in 1963 and was perhaps the first stereo system for most homes who had stereo during that time period. Fisher also produced the SA300 laboratory power amp. This amplifier used EL34 output tubes and produced 35 watts plus for each side. It also featured fully adjustable AC and DC balance as well as adjustable bias. The SA300 was built of massive proportions. Note the huge power transformer, dual 5AR4 rectifiers, and massive output transformers. The matching preamp for the SA300 was the 400CX. Again, a full-featured preamp with a center channel, dimension control, and provisions for the famous Fisher Space Expander reverb. It also had provisions for a remote balance and volume control. This was one of the more popular high-end combinations in the early 60s. Another high-end manufacturer was Harman Kardon. The Citation 1 preamp was a very sophisticated preamp in its day. All of the volume controls and tone controls were stepped. The matching amplifier is the Citation 2, using 6550s or KT88s driven by 3 12BY7 video pentodes. All power tubes could be individually biased and balanced at the rear of the chassis using the attached meter. This was the pride and joy of somebody's system in the 1962-63 era. Leek produced stereo amplifiers in the late 50s and early 60s, and this version is the Stereo 50, putting out about 25 watts per channel out of 2 EL34 output tubes. Everything was mounted on a beautifully enameled gold chassis. All transformers had variable taps, including the outputs and the power. The matching preamp is the .1, claimed to have less than 0.1% distortion. It obtains its power from the amplifier. Marantz No. 8 power amplifier, coming out in 1959, produced about 30 watts per channel. This amplifier used a pair of EL34s and small signal tubes with variable bias for each tube, measured by the attached meter built into the chassis. Marantz 10B FM tuner was perhaps the most expensive consumer tuner ever offered to the general public. It cost over $750 in 1965 and was a marvel in engineering. All knobs were machine-turned aluminum, and this tuner even had a built-in oscilloscope to measure signal strength and multipath. The chassis has well over 20 tubes and 10 IF stages. It is of massive construction, and components are of the highest grade available during that time period. Less than 5,000 of these 10B tuners were ever made, so they are extremely scarce. Macintosh's first stereo preamplifier is the C20. It was introduced in 1960. This unit is full-featured and is able to play not only long play records but also 78s because it has a built-in record compensator. It also has switchable phase, high-frequency cutoff, and variable loudness. The C20 had a multitude of inputs and outputs, as well as switched power outlets at the rear of the chassis. Their next preamp is the C11, which was introduced in 1962. It had less of the features in the C20 in that it did not have a variable record compensator. However, it did have a different styling and had the famous glass backlit Macintosh faceplate. This preamp is unusual in that the little grommets you see there hold the tips of the 12AX7 tubes. The MC225 and MX110 tuner preamp came out in the early 60s. The MC225 was a fully chromed amp chassis using 7591 output tubes producing 25 watts per side. It is the only stereo power amp from Macintosh with the squared-off transformer set. The MX110 is a combination FM stereo preamp and tuner. The entire chassis is chrome-plated and very nicely finished. The MX110 also had a chrome-plated tuning flywheel. It was equipped with several inputs and switchable power cords. The MX110 even has variable input level controls mounted at the back of the front panel. It was one of the first tuners to use the new variety of Compactron tubes. This particular unit was even performance certified at one of the famous Macintosh clinics. Perhaps the most highly sought after of all the Macintosh home equipment is the C22 and the MC275 power amplifier. These units came out in the early 60s and were produced well into the late 60s and early 70s. The power amplifier is massive in construction, and the preamplifier was very sophisticated for its day. The preamplifier has the famous glass backlit front panel and is equipped with separate controls for bass and treble, as well as switchable input selectors. There's even a switch for tape and record compensation. The MC275 is Macintosh's largest stereo tube power amplifier. This version is equipped with the famous Genelex KT88 output tubes. The amplifier weighs in well over 70 pounds and is equipped with the famous unity-coupled output transformers. H.H. Scott produced a wide variety of tuners in the 1950s and 60s. The 310 series was their top of the line. The 310C was noted to be very sensitive and selective for its day. It was even used in some versions as a broadcast monitor for radio stations. Next to this unit is the Scott 335 multiplex adapter, giving the user a full multiplex stereo signal. Scott introduced a number of integrated amps. The famous 272 was built of massive construction using EL34 output tubes with dual 5U4 rectifiers. Note that the transformers are massive in size. The faceplate is the famous Scott Champagne Tone, and this amplifier is equipped with variable binaural noise suppression. The famous 355 tuner preamp also matched up with the 208 power amp. The power amplifier is equipped with 4 7591 output tubes, producing about 20 watts per side. The 355 is a combination AM, FM stereo, and preamp. Note that the inputs are located on the top of the chassis. The power amplifier is basically the output section of a Scott 299C integrated amplifier. The largest stereo power amp that Scott produced is the famous LK150. It produced 65 watts per side from a pair of 6550s. The output transformers are humongous on this unit. The driver tubes are 7199s, and the amp even has a meter to measure bias for each pair of tubes. The matching preamp was the Scott 122 stereo binaural preamp, the last of Scott's stereo tube components. This preamplifier was produced in 1961 for a very short period of time and uses 12 tubes plus dual indicator tubes to measure the frequency response of the binaural noise system. It represents the last and highest point of American tube technology in the early 60s. In 1963, transistor designs were becoming more dominant in the home audio market. It wasn't until a decade later that vacuum tubes again reappeared on the scene, being favored by music lovers and audiophiles.